For now, though, the National Assembly is discussing the issue of student fees for the 2017 year. Let's cut across live.
To hear the voices of the students. Honourable Speaker, the Fees Commission is a compromised exercise and its objectives are questionable because it was not set up to legitimately adjudicate the fees question, but rather it is a sorry attempt to dupe students into believing that something is being done and by doing so take the steam out of the fees must fall movement. It is common cause that free education is possible and most importantly necessary. The issue therefore before us now is how do we implement free education? Honourable Speaker, allow me to also stress that the rhetoric that we have been fed that NSFAS is free education is not true. NSFAS is not free education. We must also point out that NSFAS is poorly and corruptly managed and in many respects has been a major letdown for the poor. That's where the overhaul must begin, and therefore the following is being proposed. That one, the parliamentary BRRR processes scheduled to commence in the next term must focus on redirecting funds to higher education and reducing spending in departmental programs across the board which are not geared towards service delivery. Two, the operations of NSFAS must remain decentralized and be given the full capacity to function in the various institutions with improved turnaround time on the assessment of applications, approval and payment to beneficiaries. Three, all NSFAS applications must contain the unabridged birth certificates of applicants and verification from Home Affairs must be sought through the designated unit to eliminate fraudulent applicants from accessing NSFAS funds. 4, a unit must be established in the Department of Social Development to prioritize recipients of child support grants to access NSFAS as part of the child support program. 5, SARS must track parents of NSFAS recipients to ensure that wealthy income earners are not bypassing the system through fraud and deliberate omission. And that 6, a full audit is done to assess whether the costs involved in higher education are justified. Are the prices being charged by institutions reasonable and competitive? Honourable Speaker, funds must follow functions and not individuals, and more specifically in this regard, not students. This means a new funding model, paying more emphasis, which must be placed on the capacity of institutions to handle a predetermined number of students who, even if they fail, will not result in wasteful and fruitless expenditure, and debt will not be accumulated as a burden on the student. Honourable Speaker, in appreciating the time you have allotted to this debate, I am mindful that we cannot possibly exhaust all the issues or explore all the solutions today. But the duty and responsibility rests on this House to carry on its shoulders the aspirations of the youth of South Africa. Honourable Speaker, therefore, in the coming days, I'll be moving in that this House establishes in terms of Rule 253 an ad hoc committee to look at all the issues related to the fees crisis and determine concrete solutions thereof. It is my firm belief that Parliament must take its rightful place as the representative of the people and deal with this matter once and for all. And in truth, in the final analysis, we have to have the political conviction as this House and as South Africa to say whether free education is possible or not, and take appropriate actions to respond positively to whatever conclusion we will reach. I would like to make a direct appeal to all students to desist from burning and destructing property. Let us rather burn and destruct the fees and not the very institutions which are aimed at empowering us as young people of this country. Honourable Speaker, in this very House in a question session last year when I put it to the Deputy President that the 0% fee increment was a knee-jerk reaction, the Deputy President smiled and said, no, it's not a knee-jerk reaction, we love the students. Unfortunately, love is not going to sort out the problems that you are faced with today. We need real political will and political conviction for us to step up and be able to deal with this problem. Either we shape up or we ship out. But we cannot continue on this trajectory of empty rhetoric and a zero, mindset, 0% mindset of us actually addressing this issue. We must be able to assess whether the loans which students are taking out year in and year out because of the shortcomings of NSFAS are actually fair to them. We have students who have to go out and look for jobs as waiters and waitresses, studying at late hours of the night, working in the afternoon, and attending. That cannot possibly be a conducive environment for success if we are serious about taking education forward. So across the length and breadth of our country, we're engulfed by desperation, which is on an unprecedented level, because the promises which were made in 1994 that education will be free have not materialized. We must do some soul-searching as this House, and in particular the governing party, where they've been honest to the promises they made to our people, and for them to have the honesty and decency to say where they have failed. Because you cannot make promises in a vacuum. Promises speak to the collective plight of our people, and they elect us to this House, whether in government and opposition benches, on the basis of what we have promised them. So I hope that we can be constructive today, and Honourable Speaker, once more take the time to say thank you very much. But in the final analysis, fees must fall. I thank you.
The Honourable September.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Indeed, Honourable Speaker, the current violence that we have experienced at many of our institutions must be condemned in the strongest term. This violence erodes the ability for us to continue to have the ability to seek a negotiated settlement on many aspects, as well as it erodes the ability of us to always have settlements through dialogue that we can bring about in South Africa. It must be noted, Honourable Speaker, that 6 months after the first democratically elected government in this country, President Nelson Mandela issued a proclamation appointing a National Commission on Higher Education, and he did so to preserve what is valuable, and he did so also to address what is defective and that which required transformation too. In 2000, a scientist from Norway called Johan Olsen contributed to this debate, and the importance of that debate was to bring about a discussion about modernization of higher education that can become relevant to the debate in South Africa also. He significantly argued that the pact between society and higher education had become problematic in that support on different fronts indeed have declined. In South Africa, higher education in 2016 is in many ways profoundly different from the fragmented education that we have, from the insular that we have, from the elite kind of education we have, and indeed the uneven apartheid inheritance that we received as an ANC government. Today, much has been achieved. Whilst the legacy of the past in some instances are still being shaped, and the influence in some instances remains extremely undesirable, much has been achieved in relation to the fact that we now have 1 million students that we find in our public institutions. A significant increase has been made from 1994, an increase even in the demographics that we now have in our institution. This indeed, honourable members, is a great achievement we have made as South Africa. Honourable Speaker, growth in student enrolment must now commensurate with the kind of growth in academic staff complements, as well as growth that we now require in excellence through a revised curriculum. The role the ANC has and continues to play is in taking care of making sure that public interest in higher education, and indeed remains one of the major funders if not in many instances the sole funder in higher education. What we do have is large amount of funds that come through the private sector, through things such as research that are being done, and through donations and investments. Clearly, this is an imbalance. As the debate and hearings, which we must support and not condemn, honourable members, are being undertaken in South Africa at the moment, we continue this debate, and submissions must be made, and the role of all stakeholders in society is important to go and make a contribution in furthering higher education in South Africa. We must take care that we bring a center stage without implying that, the state does not have a diminishing role in all of this. In South Africa, we continue to have very many voices. They are from the student ranks, the organizations, worker representation, business community professionals, indeed government and parliament. What is quite clear at this juncture is the fact that social demands with respect to higher education are intensifying. Indeed, as the ANC, we continue to state the correctness of the Freedom Charter that says that the doors of learning and culture must be open, and in doing so, the increased access and participation for all, but especially the poor, must remain cardinal in our entire endeavour to improve higher education. But, Honourable Speaker, worldwide research shows that the higher numbers of students are enrolling, but a decline in public investments in real terms. The correctness of the ANC policy, for example, to ask that NSFAS must play a leading role in bringing about a change in the kind of dispensation that we have, is a correct one, and this will contribute, and this will make a major contribution to what we require. What we should understand, honourable members, is that we cannot have the higher education escape addressing to the societal contestation of race, of gender, of ethnicity and diversity. As we map a path towards a stable dispensation, a sustainable financing model is worth noting that substantial resistance has been received and continues to be received, we will be hearing very soon, to the kind of transformation that this government has made, with vested academic and institutional interests leading the charge. If we look at the reports that came from the educational councils, they speak to the sector's cohesion is still challenged by levels of inequality for students and differential quality of education, and in the training sector indeed. Some institutions are attempting to reach to international rankings, while others are still at the level of either in administration or coming out of them. We are reminded that the first decade of post-apartheid dealt with integration of funding from diversity that the ANC has inherited to a situation of dealing with shared costs between government and students to achieve modernization, to allowing now for redress of previously disadvantaged institutions. Honourable Speaker, higher education system indeed remains under pressure to find a sustainable,
September, your time has
model.
expired.
I thank you.
The Honourable Pozzoli.
Honourable Speaker, everybody now agrees that the government has messed up on the funding of higher education. Even Minister Nzimande, who I notice hasn't bothered to pitch up to this debate, acknowledged to our committee recently that it had been a mistake to expand the system so rapidly without sufficient funding. So now everybody agrees, what next? We estimate that the system at present only receives half the funding it really needs. So we have 1 million students crammed into 26 underfunded universities, half of whom never complete their degrees, and most of whom can't afford to pay the fees which the universities need to close the gap. How cruel this system is to lift the hopes and dreams of the 1 million students while making it so difficult for them ever to be attained. So who should pay the missing funds? Well, it's obvious from what we see all around us that the students cannot pay what we're missing in higher education. The private sector can and should assist, but it is unlikely that they will do so at the scale required, which is in the billions. We know now that the universities can't pay. We are already seeing them going into deficit. That leaves only one candidate, the government. President Zuma's hapless outfit of losers and dubious characters, in fact, must pay. It is a hard truth, but there it is. Only the state can afford to provide the core funding for a quality higher education system. Why is this so hard to accept? We accept that schooling must be state-funded, and we continue to fund schooling generously, in spite of its severe weaknesses and its massive dropout rates. But when it comes to higher education, the Treasury doors are closed. Increases are at or below inflation, real costs are not taken into account, expansion is done on a shoestring, ever greater burdens are placed upon the system without money to pay for them, and the very notion of higher education is derided. Our president sneers at what he calls clever blacks. Graduates are told that they have wasted or useless degrees. The myth persists that graduate unemployment is very high, whereas in fact it's only 5%, and so on. We indulge this anti-intellectualism at our peril. It shows we are not serious. It reveals us to be a small-minded society without a real vision for a developed future. We sneer at the system that produces our doctors, nurses, teachers, accountants, engineers, scientists, artists, poets, writers, musicians, historians, and economists. How immature we are as a society to do this to such a precious resource. And let's turn to the future. If further, sustained and adequate funding is not invested by the state in higher education, our universities face a miserable future. Here's how things will unfold. The first thing to go will be the infrastructure. It's the obvious candidate for the first round of cuts. Universities are already cutting down on maintenance. New projects will be put on hold. Physical decay will start to set in. Student accommodation will deteriorate and fail to expand. Lecture facilities will become shabby. Laboratories and research facilities will become dated. Libraries and electronic subscriptions will become under-resourced and old, and IT systems will stagnate. The second thing to go will be the top academics. Many of them are already, and I know this for a fact, looking for jobs elsewhere, as they see the system's future looking increasingly unstable. The top academics are internationally mobile and will quickly find jobs elsewhere. There are more Nigerian academics in the US than there are in Nigeria. We don't want this to happen to us. The third thing to go will be the top administrators. Universities are vast enterprises with budgets in the billions. But who wants to lead and manage a sinking ship? We will see the university management increasingly becoming the domain, in fact it is already in some cases, of failed government bureaucrats with little experience of actual academic life and a low level of commitment to the idea of a university at all. Over time, classes will get even bigger as staff are cut. Retrenchment packages are being offered as we speak. They are usually taken by the best and most mobile staff, leaving the more mediocre to do all the teaching in ever larger and more unwieldy classes than those which already plague the system. Then the top students will start exiting the system. This too has already begun. Yale, Harvard, Oxford and Cambridge and the top Australian universities are already recruiting among our matric students and offering them full scholarships. Others will go to private local colleges where they can. The fee-paying students have options, and they will be the first to exercise them, and this will leave even less income available to universities. As the fees base shrinks, the vicious downward spiral will speed up. With income down, classes growing, top academics and students leaving, and infrastructure shabby and dated. That is our future. This is what people mean when they say our universities will simply become colleges. Places where mediocre undergraduate degrees are taught by mediocre staff, mainly to those who have no other options, where postgraduate study is increasingly difficult to sustain, and where research cannot seriously be undertaken because infrastructure and quality staff and students are just not available. This situation could arise quite quickly now, because it has invisibly been developing over 20 years. The downward spiral began long ago, and it won't take many more years for it to unravel. We are privileged to have universities that compete with the top 2% in the world. This is a great achievement for a middle-income country. There are many areas of excellence that we can be extremely proud of. Do we throw all this away now? I would argue that we are on the brink of doing so. While SAA has lost 11 billion in the past 2 years alone and is continually and irrationally bailed out, 1 million students and 26 struggling institutions remain underfunded and subjected at the most to unsatisfactory short-term solutions. They remain at the mercy of the state, which seems to believe that this crisis will somehow go away, and our minister's absence, I think, indicates the casualness with which he takes it. President Zuma and his floundering, bickering, anti-intellectual government has abandoned our precious higher education system, our national assets. We call upon the President to find sufficient long-term funding, to stabilize our universities and to find that funding fast. Thank you.
The Honorable Mates, and this is Honorable Mates's maiden speech.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Honourable Speaker, a government that loves its youth provides means to educate it. And this is not the case with the current government. We are on our own. Students, you are on your own. Students who are protesting currently all over the country are not doing so for private jets. They're not doing so for castles like the ones we built for Mr. Zuma. No, they are protesting for something very basic so they can access good quality free education. The fact that students have even resolved to these protests is proof that we have a government that has no interest in building an educated nation. And the genesis of this current higher education crisis can be traced back to policy decisions made by the ANC as soon as they took power in 1994. Despite numerous conference resolutions of the ANC, which were unequivocal about the critical importance of free education in creating a society based on values of equality and prosperity, we still have an education system that is not representative and which excludes students because they are poor and because their parents are unemployed. And it doesn't apply to you students there at the back, obviously. Currently, levels of public spending on universities sit at around 0.08% of the gross domestic product, which is a low by global standards. And only 5% of South African families can comfortably afford to pay university fees for their children. This means that without strong intervention and decisive intervention by the state, by the ANC government, to ensure access to higher education, the majority of bright black people will never have their dreams of accessing university education realized. Currently, there are about 800,000 undergraduate university students, and that's at a cost of an average of 120,000 per student per year. At this current cost, this would mean that we need at least 86 billion per year to fund higher education. And with proper prioritizing by a government, when they stop looting and all the dodgy things that they do, this government can easily get the money and put an end to the crisis of education here in South Africa, where we don't have our students being raped and murdered just because they're protesting for education. However, there is no hope for the ANC, and it is a waste of time to expect the ANC to implement free education for all right now, because they haven't done it, and it's already 22 years later. And that youth desk of the ANC has just been opportunist by writing to Blade asking him to implement free education right now. So to stabilize our institutions of higher learning, we need to do the following things immediately. Number one, legislate now that education will be free for the first degree. And this commission that Mr. Zuma keeps setting up and all those commissions are not going to help. We know what needs to be done. Can we just do it already? Number two, we need to decolonize curriculum and ensure that all our universities teach African-centered literature for the emancipation of black people.
Who's calling me?
It's a point of order that I wish to raise. The member referred to Minister Nzimande as Blade.
Oh, Minister
so I suggest
Blade.
it gets withdrawn.
Honorable Zimande or Minister Blade
Minister, yes.
All right.
Okay, I'm going to go back now. Number two, we need to decolonize the curriculum and ensure that all our universities teach African-centered literature for the emancipation of African people. Then we won't have young girls at the age of 13 protesting about hair. Number three, stop with immediate effect the suspension and expulsion of student activists and university-sponsored violence against students. And only the EFF has a very clear vision on what an educated nation should look like. Under an EFF government, the capacity of higher education institutions will be expanded to include many students who cannot currently be accepted into higher institutions. All this tender corruption that happens would stop immediately, and that money will be redirected to higher education, and there will be no harassment of students at universities. We want to put it on record that we are absolutely appalled by the conduct of the University of KwaZulu-Natal and the police who have not paid attention to the allegations of rape by policemen of students while they were protesting for free and quality education. And we call on all universities to be pragmatic in the manner in which they handle protests, so they must not fuel the anger that's already at a tipping point amongst our students because they are stigmatized and they are excluded. The final solution, however, is the introduction of free quality education, and this is a feasible goal, but it is not achievable, obviously, by the ANC government. Thank you.
Honorable Kubisa.
Madam Speaker, honorable members, thank you for the opportunity. The National Freedom Party believes that the ideal of free quality education in our country is indeed a possibility, and that can be attained. We are also aware that there is indeed a crisis in our education. The state and the universities are under siege, and we're facing huge challenges in our education system. We are really under siege. We're facing huge challenges. We also understand as National Freedom Party that the students' demands are genuine, their concerns are genuine. There must be free quality education from basic education to university in our country. But of course, on the other side of the coin, we say as National Freedom Party, the banning of the infrastructure, libraries, laboratories, lecture halls is unwarranted. The manhandling of the management, the beating of students, harassment of students is unwarranted and must be done away with. Perhaps also we need to be honest as the National Freedom Party, because we are talking education, that some of the challenges we inherited are from the apartheid regime. We did inherit a system that was fragmented. Transformation had to take a chunk of its time. Transformation of senates, councils, student societies, etc. And there is also a need to transform statutes even at the moment. That we cannot close an eye on. We say we inherited these challenges because most of the universities were referred to as the bush colleges, and that is the system that we inherited. But of course, it seems that we had to sink in the euphoria of liberation rather than going straight into reality, ensuring that the state takes charge of education in our country, because education is the responsibility of state. So when Cuba, for instance, got its freedom, the democratic state of Cuba prioritized good quality education. So the state came up with good policy priorities to deal with the state of education from early childhood right up to tertiary institutions, and that included vocational education. Another thing that Cuba did, besides ensuring that education was free and of good quality, was to ensure that there was a good working relationship between schools, tertiary institutions, and also the workplace, where students to be involved in practicum on a daily basis. And to ensure again that the student was in class, the student was taught, and the student did some work. And Cuba also ensured that they took into universities those students that were able to perform without doing away with the policy of massification of education. An 8-member panel that was set up at Wits University to report to the Presidential Commission shared a belief that the government needs to play an important role in higher education funding due to the clear social justice obligations and the need to signal that it views higher education as a priority in South Africa's social and economic and upliftment by, at a minimum, reversing the subsidy declines. The National Freedom Party believes that the state, business, civil society need to assist tertiary institutions to deal with the fees crisis. And we say as the NFP, we must move closer to an ideal of free education in our country. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honorable Siwela.
Honorable Speaker, Deputy President, honorable members, distinguished guests, good afternoon. Speaker, the debate takes place at a time when higher education sector is in financial distress, plunging it into deep crisis that often results in violent student protests that culminate in the destruction of property. This act of destroying property should be condemned by this House as well as the people at large. The ANC understands the significant role the higher education and training sector has to play in building a developmental state, guiding economic development, capacitating its human potential, and enabling people to be their own liberators. The call for free education is not new. This was underpinned by the Freedom Charter when the people that met said the doors of learning and culture shall be open. This was a call for education for all, for efficient and effective institutional structures of education, for schools to be centers of community life, and for sustainable, safe, and healthy environments for learning while ensuring the highest quality of education is provided. In principle, the Freedom Charter imagines a future South Africa where education shall be free, compulsory, universal, and equal for all children, where higher education and technical training shall be open to all by means of state allowances and scholarships awarded on the basis of merit that is a literate and learning society. The ANC's 52nd conference and later in its 52nd conference and later as reiterated in the 53rd resolved that there shall be free education for the poor, not for all, and that this need to be progressively introduced. Consequently, the Department of Higher Education and Training committed itself to progressively introducing free quality education for the poor in South Africa as it is feasible, though this requires additional funding. To this effect, a commission of inquiry into higher education and training was established earlier this year with the mandate of investigating the feasibility of making higher education and training fee-free. Earlier this week, the public hearings were hosted over 2 days here in Cape Town. This process is ongoing. One of the biggest lessons in post-colonial experiences is that free education in a society with deep social and, more importantly, economic disparities has entrenched gross inequalities. This was an unintended consequence as it reproduced and reinforced colonial and post-colonial imbalances. This was so because in countries like Mozambique and Kenya, had an uneven distribution of schools that provided a quality education, low participation rates, and transition between primary and secondary school phases. Whereas a large amount of university students came from the best resource schools in Kenya and entered into free public education institutions in often prestigious programs. The cost of higher education in low economic growth in the face of increasing expensive university fees leads to underfunding and the deterioration of systems and quality. Outside the cost of higher education, with increased access into the sector, more resources are required for free education to prevail. The rationale and model on funding institutions requires serious attention. This is to ensure that there is a system in place that transforms this sector in a manner that redresses imbalances. The funding model has to address funding student tuition and related needs with enhancing the capacity of institutions. A number of countries that once offered free higher education today exhibit a cost-sharing model with a mix of public-private financing. Moving forward, experience informs us that the maintenance and upgrading and expansion of technical vocational education and training and community colleges is important for not
On a point of order, Speaker.
What's the
easing
point
pressure.
of order, Honourable Member?
On a point of order.
What's the point of order?
I'm rising on Rule 83, Speaker. A member may not read a speech. Can you please rule on that, Speaker?
Honourable Member, as you know, in fact, honourable members read their speeches. Go ahead, honourable member, finish your speech.
Okay, thank you. Free education that is built on an unequal social and economic structures ends up reproducing the very system it aims to transform. As governments consider free education for poor, issues to consider include the following.
Honourable member, your time has expired.
Thank you.
Honourable Macheke.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker and honourable members. The current student fees debacle is symptomatic of the unguided social dynamics at work, where interest groups fight to escape the cost of the fiscal adjustment. We condemn destruction of buildings at institutions of higher education.
Visuals there coming from the National Assembly, where the stakeholders are discussing the student fees for 2017.